Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Nancy Scheper-Hughes. Nancy Scheper-Hughes is a professor of anthropology at the University of California at Berkeley, where she also directs the doctoral program in critical studies of medicine, science, and the body. Her many publications include Saints, Scholars, and Schizophrenics, which received the Margaret Mead Award, and Death Without Weeping, The Violence of Everyday Life in Brazil, which received several awards, including the International Petrie Prize and the Wellcome Medal of the Royal Anthropological Institute. She is currently writing a book entitled Who's the Killer? Violence and Democracy in the New South Africa. Nancy, welcome.
Thank you, Harry. It's great to be here.
Where were you born and raised?
In Brooklyn, New York, Williamsburg, which was an immigrant section of New York City, and part of the time also in Queens, New York.
And this setting was a very diverse one for a young girl growing up.
Yeah, the post-World War II period, there were waves of various kinds of immigrants coming in, people that had still been displaced after World War II, so it was a large Eastern European community. It had been an Irish community. They had been displaced. And then in the early 50s, when I started grade school, the Puerto Rican community began to form. And so overnight, seemingly, it became a Spanish-speaking community. How
did your parents shape your character, do you think?
Well, my mother was first-generation Czech American. We lived on a block, South 3rd Street, Brooklyn, that was dominated by the Snoyemskas. That was my mother's family, so it was a bit of a matriline. My mother and her 8 sisters and brothers, they'd married, they lived there. My dad was of German Lutheran background, many more generations back, but like all the men in this clan, they came to move on South 3rd Street. And we lived together as an extended family, and we thought of ourselves as a clan. And we lived cheek by jowl with people that had just recently arrived, also from Lithuania, from Poland, from Russia, and it was also a large Hasidic Jewish community. So we lived close to each other, not always understanding each other.
And so it was a working class setting then?
Yes, it was poor to working class, a little bit forming underclass at the same time. As the Puerto Ricans arrived, they were mainly sugarcane cutters that came from the hills of Puerto Rico, and they came without too many resources at that point.
And what was your schooling like in this setting?
I began in public school, which was right next door, and spent kindergarten and first grade there. And then, because I was raised also in a pretty intensely Catholic community, I requested to go to the nuns. And so by the 2nd grade, I crossed the street and went to St. Peter and Paul's Church School.
And any books that you remember now that you read as a young person?
Well, as a very young person, if we're talking 1st grade and 2nd grade. My father was an avid reader. Both of my parents were self-educated and had not been schooled, really. But they took advantage of the library, and so almost daily at night, my dad would read to me. I think my favorites were Grimm's fairy tales. And for me, I guess, born pretty much into a slum, these fairy tales were a great escape.
In what sense?
I loved anything that was rural. I loved stories about forests. I loved stories about peasants. And I think that this had an indelible mark in me in terms of at least initially wanting to pursue rural life and understand more about that. And then I came back after many years to looking at people who lived in slums, newly arrived, in shantytowns and squatter camps, which I think reproduced again some of the things I wasn't quite ready to face when I first started anthropology.
Do you have any recollections of any significant mentors? I know the nuns identified you as someone who should be given the opportunity to have more advanced schooling.
Yeah, well, I think my 1st grade teacher, Mrs. Weinrib, was terribly important in that regard in 1st grade. And she was a mentor who taught, among other things, taught us to be proud of the fact that we were citizens, even if we were newly arrived ones, and not to be ashamed that many of us in the classroom were accepting family assistance and welfare of one kind or another. And I think in one of my more recent pieces, 2 Cents for Welfare, I talk about a little ritual that Mrs. Weinrib had established where after the distribution of cookies and milk, she would line us all up and ask us to contribute something to welfare. Now, I don't know where that went, whether it was just to supply money for cookies and milk for those that didn't have any, but we were to come up in front of the room and raise our 2 cents or our 3 cents.
And literally
say,
2 cents.
Literally, I did.
Yeah.
Mrs. Weinrib, I give 2 cents for welfare. And then the nuns were very formative as well, although you know, every year in school they would ask you, you know, what you hoped to be when you grew up. They called it your vocation. And I had a very traumatic event when I was, I guess, in 3rd or 4th grade. My parents not only took advantage of the library, but also the museums. And one of the museums my elder brother and cousins were brought to on a pretty regular basis was the Museum of Natural History. And I became completely enamored of that museum and what it had to offer. And so on one of my essays, I wrote that I was going to be a naturalist when I grew up. And Sister Mary Teresa took me aside and with horror said, "Nancy, you can't be a naturalist." And I said, "Sister, why?" She said, "You must always keep your clothes on."
I see. So you went into anthropology, actually, as a compromise.
Right.
Now, you went to, as an undergraduate, you went to Queens.
I started at Queens
You
College.
started in Queens.
Yeah.
But you were caught up in the turbulence of the 60s.
That's right.
And how did coming to maturity in the 60s affect you think, now in retrospect?
Well, I think it began for me really as a senior in high school. In a little Catholic high school, I was sent to the Soviet Union to debate with students.
Oh, gee.
It was the first time I was ever outside of New York, and the first time on a plane. And I was surrounded by people who thought about the world in very, very different ways. And I think I was supposed to be defending Pope Leo XIII's encyclical on labor, and people found me very humorous. But I was extremely affected by seeing Europe for the first time and realizing that ideologies were necessarily had to be contested, because I came back with a very different view of not so much of, you know, the state of communism, but actually of young people who were atheists, who saw the world in a different way. And that was the message I brought back. And needless to say, the nuns stopped me giving talks.
So was this a radicalization in a way?
That was the beginning, I think, of a radicalization. And then in Queens
And this
College,
would have been what year, by the way?
This would have been around 1959, 1960.
So the height of the Cold War.
Perhaps.
The height of the Cold War.
Yeah. Then, no, 1962, so it was 61. 62, I went to Queens College and got immediately involved in student peace movement there and in the civil rights movement. And actually stayed only 2 years. In 1964, 2 recruiters came to campus, one talking about Mississippi Freedom Summer, and Sergeant Shriver talking about the Peace Corps. So I applied to both programs, and much to the dismay of the greatest mentor I really ever had in my life, who was Hortense Powdermaker, the anthropologist at Queens College. And she said, "Well, I guess I can't dissuade you from dropping out of school. I did it myself. I joined the labor movement. I went to Chicago and so forth." And I accepted the first one that came through, which was Peace Corps, and went to Brazil. And always had, I guess, a moment of doubt about that, because one of the people that I knew who had signed up for Mississippi Freedom Summer was Andy Goodman. And he was in my creative writing class. And Andy, of course, died in Mississippi.
And he was one of the 3 civil rights workers
right.
whose murder became a cause célèbre at the time. And was a major moment in that period of the civil rights movement.
And when I heard about that, I was in Peace Corps training in Brattleboro, Vermont, and at that point I said, "I'll go back and I'll replace Andy when I'm done with the Peace Corps work," which I did about 2.5 years later.
And in the Peace Corps, we'll go back to the civil rights in a moment. You went to Brazil,
right?
And it was a community in some ways like where you had come from, where sugar was an important and an oppressive industry,
Right.
I guess you would say.
It was the other side. I was brought up in a family of factory workers, some of whom worked in the sugar house, and it wasn't by any great choice of mine that I was sent to Brazil. In fact, I had requested Africa. But I was told by the Peace Corps that since I really wanted to do community organizing, that the best place to do that would be in Brazil. And they said, don't worry, because you'll love Brazil. It's just like Africa. Not quite right, except that the Afro-Brazilian community was very strong. And so, yes, this was a community in which, at that point, some 80% or more of the people living in newly formed squatter camps around a market town were employed in cutting sugarcane. So I got to see the other side of how sugar was produced and the kind of debt peonage relations in which sugar workers were kept, in which they were always in debt and always therefore obligated to return to work and never quite earning enough. I mean, there were various relations of labor, from being sharecroppers to being peasants working in between the sugarcane to a sort of detached proletarianized labor force that had been thrown off the plantation and sold themselves in small contracts. And you know, it was my work there was primarily in health, and
so you, on the one hand, you were getting a big picture, a sense of the economic and social inequalities, but on the other hand, you were trying to minister the people's needs in things like a daycare center, right?
Right,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Helped to open a daycare center for working women, because many of the women in this newly formed squatter camp that at that time had about 4,000 people worked in the sugarcane, weeding or helping stack cane. Women weren't supposed to cut, but a great many women that I worked with actually dressed as men, and they could make more money by pretending, you know, and then cutting cane and bringing their children often with them. The babies that were altogether too young, they would often leave at home, locked up in the little huts that they lived, little mud huts that they lived in, sometimes with an older child taking care of them, sometimes with a senile older person, and that contributed in part to the very high rates of infant mortality. And since I was working primarily with mothers and children, it was rather a shock for me to day after day hear the bells ringing of Nossa Senhora das Dores Church and have to be helping mothers bury their babies.
And you would come back and study this, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So you finished your tour of duty, you came back, and then you went into the civil rights movement and went south, working on programs to bring government programs to the poor in the South. Tell us
it was an organization that was founded by Don Jelinek, who today is on the City Council of Berkeley, who's a lawyer from New York City. And I think that his original idea was that many people had been going to the South to try to integrate the Tasty Freeze, but it didn't matter to rural people, especially black sharecroppers who didn't have the money to buy ice cream at Tasty Freeze. So he became interested in less glamorous issues, questions around entitlements that rural poor, mainly black people, but whites as well, although we didn't deal with the white population. We couldn't at that time. You had to sort of choose sides. It was a highly polarized environment. And the question was, why weren't these small sharecroppers having access to federal subsidies that were given to all farmers, presumably? In addition, they were not having access to some of the food programs, rather primitive food programs, food commodities programs. And we learned that although these were federal programs, they were administered locally by a very small white class that controlled the counties. And if they said, we don't have any hunger, then they didn't take the programs. But worse, the checks, the subsidy checks, the cotton allotment checks, these were being pocketed by the landlords, although they were supposed to be distributed among the people that were sharecroppers or that were tenant farmers. And so most of these federal programs completely bypassed the population that most needed them. And so we, probably the most significant thing that we worked on as a group was a lawsuit against the Department of Agriculture, suing then Secretary of Agriculture Orville Freeman for allowing Americans to go hungry. And here it was, I think the only contribution per se that I could bring was that I had worked with very hungry people in northeast Brazil, and I could recognize the signs of hunger. which often, if you're not used to it, you don't recognize these large bellies and certain sores that people would have from pellagra, or just the eyes and fingernails and things that, from 10 feet, I could tell you whether someone had what kind of nutritional imbalance. And so what we did is basically we brought some doctors in, and we did a survey with some 500 households in several black belt counties, and then I worked with a small group of civil rights workers identifying some of the really worst households and asking people to come by bus to Washington, D.C. and to present themselves before a panel of judges and in a lawsuit, class action suit, Peoples versus the Department of Agriculture.
And was that successful?
We lost in court, but won in the media. And as a result, New York Times and Tribune and
CBS
Globe
reports.
And CBS reports. Hunger in America was put out, and I think really because of that movement, the food stamp program was brought into counties that didn't have it previously.
So overall, you were, by this mix of domestic and international experience, we're getting a sense of inequality and a sense of activism, and that something could marginally maybe be done about it to correct the situation.
I think I was an optimist from this more engaged work, but always there was a side of me that was more reflective, and that would get exhausted by the work and would want to go into a back room and write about it and think about it, and to raise larger questions about what is, anthropos after all? What kind of a species are we? Why do we treat each other the way we do? Some of those basic sort of ethical questions.
And so it was natural that you would then, when you decided to come back to school, to go into anthropology, and your teacher had moved to Berkeley, is that right?
Yeah, my mentor, Hortense Powdermaker, retired, came to Berkeley, and kept in touch with me while I was in the South, and said, Nancy, sooner or later you're going to get tired of this activism. I did. Then when you do, come to Berkeley and work for me. So I worked for her briefly as a research assistant, and then finished up my interrupted undergraduate degree, and then entered the graduate program for anthropology.
Now, I think you've given us a sense. You've answered the question I was going to ask you, which was, why did you choose anthropology? But you say, in characterizing your own work in an interview somewhere else, you said, my books are an attempt to strip away our common everyday understanding of the human condition. I'd like to interrogate these common understandings to say, perhaps we need to rethink what it means to be normal, what it means to be mad, what it means to be male or female, what it means to be a mother. Is that what you've tried to pursue in your work?
I'd say that's one of the main themes of my work, is that we have, of course, certain assumptions about what motherhood is about, what madness is about, what the norm is. And I think that anthropology and anthropologists are particularly well situated, and always have been, to question those assumptions. And I think some of my professors at Berkeley were surprised that, since I had a very politicized background and was involved in People's Park protests and Third World Strike at Berkeley, that why I chose such a strange topic to go to rural Ireland and study madness among bachelor farmers as a projection of cultural themes.
And why did you do that?
I did it, I'd always been fascinated by Irish culture and society, and by literature. In fact, among, you asked what books had influenced me, reading the Irish poets and reading the great autobiographical books that had come out of the Blasket Islands was always something that I enjoyed. I could not go back to Brazil, which was at that point, which was the obvious place to go, because I didn't only minister to people's bodies, I was politically active in Brazil. I worked with a peasant union that was banned. I worked with what was left of the Peasant League movement in Northeast Brazil. I worked with the beginnings of the stirrings of a liberation theology, and as a result the Fourth Army came in and ended the work, at least temporarily, and put some of the people in jail, interrogated me, and said that I had to leave the country as an agitator. And I'm sorry now that I accepted, in a way, the help of the government. The Peace Corps management came in and said that if I left, then all of Peace Corps would leave Brazil, and so I was allowed to stay and finish my work. So I could not go back to Brazil. I chose Ireland because I had, going back to those Grimm's fairy tale stories, a somewhat romanticized notion about what life in a really rural economy and ecology would look like. I wanted to have contact at least once with the people who really lived as semi-peasants or post-peasants, whatever you want to call them, on small land holdings, and to see what kinds of community grew out of that, what kinds of social relations. Initially, I wanted simply to study gender and sexuality because the Irish were known for having very late age of marriage, and I was curious, you know, how that was socialized in young, wild, raw, sexualized bodies. I was influenced by certain Freudian assumptions, and I thought, well, this must take a powerful set of institutions. But when I arrived in Ireland, I was within 2 days visiting a psychiatrist who was the head of a large psychiatric facility in Cork on my way out to the West, and he said, oh, you Americans are really preoccupied with the question of sex. Why don't you look at a much more important issue? Why do we have so much madness coming out of Western Ireland? And so I immediately took up the challenge. And with these psychiatric hospital censuses in hand, I went to a kind of a typical community, if you can speak that, on the western end of the Dingle Peninsula, and tried to see what was going on in terms of the basic subsistence patterns, the economic and material basis of people's lives, what was going on inside families, and what was happening between the sexes, what was Irish sexuality about, and ultimately, could cultural anthropology help answer this puzzle, which up until that point, Irish doctors were assuming the high rates of schizophrenia was perhaps a result of a brain drain or a genetic dregs hypothesis, a terribly negative view of rural Ireland, that the best had left and the worst had stayed behind, intermarried, and then produced this terrible problem.
Now, to answer this question, help us understand. You moved your family to Ireland, the small village, and integrate. You help us understand what field research means, because you did it in this particular case. So, in terms of your family and the life you undertook, you really integrated yourself. You were, to use your own words, an intimate stranger. Is that
right? Sometimes I think. You know, Hortense referred to stranger and friend, and sometimes I think it's the traitor and the friend, because what I've learned after all of my years of writing about communities in which we form deep friendships and relationships is that the process of writing itself is, of course, a form of objectification, and people are never completely satisfied with what you have to say about them. And so it's a relationship built in terms of a kind of a clash of interpretations, a collision of cultures, and I do think that that's both the value and the danger of anthropology. As an outsider comes from out of nowhere, comes into the community, asks permission to stay and to live in, and to basically be a kind of an eye on the community. And you do a lot of interviewing, right? I mean, you're constantly talking to people about... But not the way you interview. I see. And what is the difference? Tell me what the difference is. Well, in the classical pattern, which I don't necessarily do today, you're basically just living with people and overhearing. And only raising questions perhaps after 6 months of living in. So you try to get it on the fly. You try to, insofar as possible, integrate yourself into the community. Of course, you never really are. It's a myth. People try. A small community, by the way, it's not only the outsider who needs to be integrated in just to understand, but also to live. You can't live in a tiny community of 400 people because you're dependent on them for... people are dependent on each other for who has the turf, you know, who sells the chickens, you know, so you really do have to be integrated. But for a small Irish isolated community, they need to integrate you as well, because they don't know how to make sense. Otherwise, you're not a tourist. And so it's a very fragile trust.
So you go through a period where, in a sense, they feel comfortable with you. And
Right.
and you in turn are learning what questions to ask them
Right.
to really understand
Right.
what's going on.
Right. And you talked about my family. I suppose I wouldn't have been accepted at all if it weren't for my family. That is, it was a normalizing thing that I came.
And your husband came and taught.
He taught school. It was a little tiny secondary school that was the only school available for the rural children on the Dingle Peninsula who didn't have money or means to go to a private school or to travel. So he taught history, and he actually taught religion for the priest who didn't want to teach the class, although Michael was not trained as a Catholic. So it was a rather odd version of religion that he was giving in the classroom. And
And your children, you brought your children?
brought
and
the
they
children.
Were children
They were between the ages of 3 months and 4.5, I think. So they were basically on my back and being carried on the front, and a little toddler. But the toddler, Jennifer, went to the local school because children started school there at the age of 4. And it was really through all those engagements around the family that I was able to do my work, although I have to say a good deal of my interviewing took place in the pub. And that was quite a shock because the farmers who went, bachelor farmers, males, women were supposed to go in a back room and maybe have a little sherry. But the fact that I would take turns with Mike, my husband, and come to the pub meant that I probably ruined the first 3 months of their of their nights out. I didn't go every night.
Right.
But then when they became accustomed to me, I was brought into the group, and I know it sounds like a hopelessly romantic trope that you become for a woman an honorary male, but I can honestly say that was the case, and I know that the men in the pub completely forgot that I was a woman or that I was a married woman. And I learned their gestures. I learned to sigh the way they did. I learned to wrap my arms around men without having any, sexual meaning at all, but rather solidarity when men were singing political songs. And it was really quite an amazing experience to have been accepted that way.
Now, back when you, in the 60s, you had obviously experienced the women's movement here. Did that affect you in what you were saying? Did that make you more comfortable in this process, and that it empower you to better see the strength of individual women there, which you talk about in your recent essay?
I was, yes, certainly exposed to feminism. Probably the civil rights movement and some of the other political movements affected me somewhat more than until later, the feminist movement. And in my later work, I would say in Brazil, it was certainly the questions I were raising had to do with what does it mean to be a woman under conditions of horrible scarcity. But I would say that I am a feminist who raises questions and approaches the world in a way, as my friend Karen Sachs once said, that no feminist in her right mind would. So I would say that I brought feminist assumptions, and yet which allowed me to see that women were not as much troubled in Western Ireland as men. And so I actually spent most of my time in Ireland concerned with the bachelor farmers and the young men who were being made to be the caretakers and were in a sense themselves in a very feminized position. So perhaps you could say it allowed me to see the made-upness of gender, that just because you had an ideology that said that men were dominant in Western Ireland didn't mean that that's the way it felt to the young men who were in a transition state in Ireland. Really what I was observing was the decline and the really utter demise of small-scale farming as Ireland joined the EEC, and as this sort of non-productive farming as a way of life was being phased out. And so you had young men that were really caught in a trap where they were being asked to stay home and run a farm and take care of parents, in which there was really no longer any economic rewards for doing so.
And that this was the root of the high levels of schizophrenia?
Well,
one of the.
Well, what was going on really was a kind of a sorting out, and in a sense, the more vulnerable children were staying behind. I don't think they were chosen in childhood because parents saw schizophrenia in the children or anything like that, but rather that the latter-born child or the most docile son, the sweetest son, would often be chosen because would be more malleable. And where this sort of schizophrenia comes in, I was very much operating under, well, I used what was available to me theoretically at the point, which was a kind of a psychoanalytic, neo-Freudian feminist, if you will, approach. And the double-bind theory of Gregory Bateson was quite important in terms of understanding communications within the family. And I began to see that the young men, and not the young women, were targeted for a double-binding series of injunctions that was very confusing, especially to a vulnerable child.
So they were both rewarded and punished.
And punished at the same time. They were told that they needed to stay because they were chosen, they were loved, they were wanted, and at the same point they were told that if they had had more intelligence, if they had had more initiative, if they were like their older brothers and sisters, they would have been out of here because you were being kept behind for a community and a family life that, in a village that wasn't thought of as very valuable at all. If the young man decides, I don't want this anymore, also by staying they would never be able to marry because the women were leaving in droves. And so they would be told, not only by their families, but also the local power structure, which would be the priest, and it would be the teachers would chime in. They'd give a nickname to the child, you're Tige the farmer. But they were told that, well, it's all right that they won't marry because they really were not very attractive to begin with. Well, if they decide to leave, then the double injunction comes in. How could you leave? You're a traitor to the only thing that really matters. So you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. And what I found was that when I went to the county mental hospital and I began to study the first episodes of schizophrenia, there was a very high prevalence of males and a high prevalence of targeted farm inheritors.
Obviously, in an hour, we can't cover all of the work, and I do want to touch on your work in Brazil, but a common theme in all of this work, I think, is looking at the public records, at the statistical information, and then, but trying to find the story behind it. And also, and in part, doing that by embedding yourself in the community, as you've just described, but also finding the larger story, and then confronting these realities that in part you find by interviewing and talking to people and so on.
So in Brazil, I guess I started out with a question of the high incidence of infant mortality. What did that mean for women who had to face 4, 5, 6, in some cases 11 deaths in a row? What did it mean for their understanding of motherhood? What did it mean in terms of their sense of optimism and hope? And what did it mean for the children who lived? How were they raised, given the spaces that they were made to fill of all the children who had died before?
The setting here, we have to emphasize, is the unbelievable deprivation and poverty that they are trying to eke out an existence.
I returned 16 years later to the northeast of Brazil and went back to the same squatter camp where I had lived for 2 years, because I lived in the community in a mud hut, you know, with the people, and began by working with records. You're right, I went to the Cartório Civil and got the documented number of deaths, and then I would take a selected year and a neighborhood, and I would talk door to door with informants, and I found that a great deal of child death and infant death was not recorded, that there's at least a 30% difference, and in some cases even higher than that.
And when it was recorded, oftentimes it wouldn't be a very good description. It was a kind of a...
No, what was recorded would be, first of all, the statistics were made up by records written by hospital orderlies, not by doctors. Often there was no physician who would witness a death, or it would be someone from the mayor's office who was giving out pauper coffins and would say, or the mother or the sister or a little child could go to the Cartório Civil and register a death. In fact, in a country like Brazil, which of course is a first world, third world mix, as the United States is, it's a highly bureaucratic country. It's a place where you need triplicates of everything to register a car, to expand on a house, and yet for a child's death, anyone can report it. And so most of the records were useless because the cause of death would be left blank, or the cause of death would be a folk ailment, or it would be heart stopped, respiration stopped. Child died because child lived, essentially. It was an utterly naturalized understanding of infant death for that class, for the very poor. And so I decided I would track these deaths. I did it not only through interviews, of course I did interviews with 100 women, close to 100 women, getting them to tell me the context around each of the deaths of their children and what they thought, you know, were the causes of death, but also interviewing children, because children in Northeast Brazil are the ones who bury the dead, and they're the ones who form the procession. What do they think about death? Sometimes it meant going to the coffin maker. The one thing that the municipality of the place I call Bom Jesus did to respond to this problem of terrible infant mortality was to hire full-time a carpenter. And the official carpenter made free baby coffins, so I would interview him on how many coffins did he make. How many nails did he need? Well, you were using just cardboard. I see, you don't even need nails. You're using paper to line these coffins. Well, after all, they're pauper coffins. They about 50 cents a piece we spend on them. And then I say to Marcia, well, I need to know exactly how many deaths this year had occurred. Well, I don't keep records exactly on that. I can tell you something about my materials. Well, why don't you keep records? Well, nobody is interested. Nobody really cares.
Yeah.
And so then you begin to uncover, again, that which is normalized, that which is routine. And I see that as a great pathogen, of course, in human life. The accommodation that institutions have, not only individuals themselves or women and mothers themselves who accepted that a large number of their children would have to die in order to make room for the ones that lived. So I was also interested in this sort of philosophy that underlies dealing with death.
But here you are an activist, a feminist, but also at the same time a scholar and a researcher, and you come in touch with this reality, really learn it in the way you've described, and then you come to a conclusion which was against the grain, so to speak,
very much
about the women. And what was that?
Well, I concluded it was no surprise to the women themselves because I went back and gave them copies of the book. They were illiterate, they couldn't read, but I showed them pictures. They knew exactly what I was saying because they said, well, Nancy, that's what we told you. That is that they contributed to the death of their children. That is, they had an understanding that not all children that are conceived are meant to live. They're all meant to be born, so they did not, these were traditional Catholic women who did not believe in abortion, although some of them practiced abortion. They believed it was a grave mortal sin. They practiced birth control, but mainly after the fact, that is, after they had 4 or 5 children living to the age of about 8 or 9, they would ask for tubal ligation to sort of end the whole thing. But basically they said some babies were born as red babies, some babies were born as white babies. Both babies, you know, can give you trouble. Some babies are simply difficile de criar, they're difficult to raise, and a mother must be able to identify a child who is only going to give trouble, who is only going to be rescued time and time again, but will die, will disappoint you in the end. And sometimes the white babies are the little pale babies, anemic babies. They don't cry very loudly. The red babies are babies that have fits, that have high fevers and go into a kind of what looked like to the women a state of possession, and they were quite afraid of some of these babies. Now these convulsions were simply brought on by dehydration and by fevers and that were untreated, and often did not, from a medical point of view, mean that the child was untreatable. But to the women of the Alto, such babies were untreatable, and you allowed them to die. That was the expression that they used. You collaborated with nature. You helped God bring them over to the other side.
So what you discovered on the basis of having had a relationship with this community over many years, because you had been there in the 60s, you had gone back several times, and now you were doing this piece of research, was that a culture had evolved that made sense in the context of the harsh realities, the inequalities, the oppression that they were existing under.
Yeah. These were women who had gone through a life that was marked by chronic hunger, frequently by shortages in basic, I mean, you could say starvation at times. They had been abandoned often by their own fathers. They had a series of chaotic relationships. Men came and went, babies came and went. The only solid, might say, people in the community were women who said, we can't move. We don't even have the freedom to die or to run away the way men do. We have to be here for the others. They saw themselves as the rock, you might say, the foundation of the community. And so it was all right that men circulated. It was even all right that babies circulated through. But they, at all costs, I think one woman had said to me, don't weep for the babies who died. Weep for the mothers who have to live, who don't have the luxury to be able to die young.
And as children survived and they get older, then you see a more typical relationship.
Attachment? Yeah, I guess what I described, which was at variance at that point, considered quite radical. I think today much of what I've said would seem common sense. That is that motherhood is not a biological, exclusively phenomenon. Neither is, as fatherhood is social, so is motherhood. Motherhood entails a choice. One, as a woman, is, you might say, existentially thrown into the world as a potential mother. But motherhood begins with an acceptance, an unfolding, a willingness to nurture a child. And these women would mother, they would attach, they would bond, but it really began later. It began more or less after the first year of life. During that first year of life, the child is human, has a soul. It's not a thing, not objectified, not reified, but it's more like a spirit child. It's not clear whether this child isn't going to just fly off into the afterlife, and you look for the signs that let you know that this child is a visitor, is a household guest. And then they act and behave towards that child accordingly. And some of their behaviors are designed not perhaps intentionally, but have the effect of bringing on death more quickly. That is, by giving less food and water. And by, when the child has a convulsion, putting the child in a room, comfortably situated, but saying, the child is fighting with death right now. Don't interfere. Let it work its way out. So not necessarily intervening strongly to save the child.
You, in a recent essay to a new edition of the Ireland book, quote the Irish poet, Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney, and you say, to begin with, I wanted the truth to life to possess a concrete reliability. And I rejoiced most when the poem seemed most direct, an upfront representation of the world it stood in for, or stood up for, or stood its ground against. That's really a statement about the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I suppose this would be very contested by many of the postmodernist anthropologists who would say that, you know, representation is never a direct sort of thing. It's obviously mediated through the kind of person you are and the various experiences, life experiences you bring. But I would have to say that I still believe that there are better facts and weaker facts and better representations and weaker representations. And I did believe that the one obligation of the anthropologist was to try, insofar as possible, as to give a close to the bone reading of what life feels like for the groups of people with whom you wish to cast your lots for the period of time you're there, even though the truths, so to speak, contested truths, partial truths, fragmented truths, whatever, were often brutal. I think I've tended to view the social world from a kind of topsy-turvy position. I tend to look at the world through the vulnerable, through the mad, through the excluded, through the angel children of Northeast Brazil. What a way to approach family life. Some women have felt that it didn't express enough solidarity with women. But I don't think that's true, because I feel that I probably know the women of the Alto do Cruzeiro as well as I know any of my closest women friends. That means we're always other to each other. I can't permeate someone else's or soul to understand them, but I feel that the women trusted me enough to share with me things that were very painful for them, and also to show that even people with their backs up against the wall, having to make terrible decisions, still have decisions to make. If we were to say instead that everything was the result exclusively of the social economic structure, which to me is always at the base, then denies people the little bit of praxis that they have. And so perhaps it was considered a cruel sort of thing to go into people who are already suffering so much scarcity, to ask them, how do you behave when you don't have enough? Well, it's like asking questions of people, obviously, who came out of a concentration camp. People still make moral choices. And I suppose it helps the anthropologist understand more about who we are as a species by looking at people in extremis, almost. And of course, I felt that the women were making choices that any of us would be forced to make, were we living under those conditions, that they were not, it was not something lacking in them that forced them to make the choices. It was the conditions that overdetermined the choices they had to make.
These people who you look at in these extreme situations, is there, what is the key to their surviving? Is there a common element here? Some of the questions I raised about the women of the Alto were the wrong questions. I looked for resistance. I looked to see how can people accept these conditions, and I looked to the history of movements and struggles and found that they were very few and far between, had mostly been extinguished very readily by the state and by the government. And then they directed me away from questions of resistance to questions of existence. They were existentialists in a way. And what maintained them was simply and purely a love of the life that they had, as limited as it was. So Bew, one of three very key women friends and informants that I got to know, after going through so many childhood deaths, going through abandonment by 2 or 3 different men, I see her putting on a short skirt and getting ready for Carnival, and me questioning her and saying, and you, Bew, are going to dance Carnival? And she says, yes, I will dance, I will sing, and I will play. And the rich people will say, look at that pobrecito, look at that, pobrezinho in Portuguese, like me, who can still have a good time. And she said, but I can, and that's my strength, that I still will dance, even in the face of death. And I think that that's, what you have to celebrate, and what I had to celebrate at the end of Death Without Weeping was the fact that they, like Dilsey and Faulkner's Sound and the Fury, I think that's where it's from, that they endured and that they survived, and that it was resilience, I guess is the question you're asking, rather than resistance or a sense of struggle or improvement or whatever. They just wanted to make it through. And hopefully as many of their children to make it through with them as well. We've gotten a sense, as you've talked, of the roots of your thinking and your approach to problems. But I'm curious about the courage of the researcher, in this case you. It takes a lot of courage to do this work in these extreme situations, does it not? You go back to Ireland 20 years later, and the community wants you out the door right away. In Brazil, you in a way become a part of these very harsh circumstances, and then you have to bring back theories, or come up with theories that the conventional wisdom doesn't want to buy into, or that goes against support. Tell me a little about that.
Well, I think that by nature, or perhaps, anthropologists are self-selected people who are uncomfortable in their own lives and in their own cultures, their own societies. And so perhaps what you're calling courage, I would call a kind of a desperate search for community life somewhere that makes sense, or some parts of it that make sense to you to bring back, you know, to your life. I see us as I've used the term that Seamus Heaney has used, as hunters and gatherers of human values. I think we're terribly concerned with notions of the good and how to find those and understand those. I would say that in many respects I'm a kind of a phobic person, and therefore rather fearful. But I love the field. I love going into the field. There are many uncomfortable moments, the moments when you have to read back to people what you've described, which I take as a kind of a code of ethics, that even if people are illiterate, I have to draw pictures or tell stories or bring photographs to let them know how they're being represented, and to say, okay, argue this with me. At least I'll try to get your arguments, you know, into the book. In Ireland, it was very difficult to go back. I knew that the community was angry about the choice of subject matter, writing about Irish family life and society and community in terms of mental illness, but I felt that it was necessary to go back. I had tried to go back once before, about 3 years after the book was first published. I wrote consistently year after year saying, can I come back now? Can I sit down with you around a table and talk about what I wrote, what you would like me to say about you? And finally I was told I could come back, and went last summer in '99, and I lasted about 3 weeks before the community began building up. And particularly certain groups within the community who we would call sort of perhaps cultural nationalists, who were aligned with the new IRA, very sort of extreme fringe of the IRA, who felt that they could make a point in having me more or less run out of the community. I had my protectors, but they felt themselves compromised by, and who knows what would happen to them afterwards if I was continued to be kept on.
Let's say there are students out there who watch this on the web or somewhere, and they say, hey, I want to do that. What traits, what skills do you need? You obviously have to be able to listen, and you have to not be afraid to be around people who are quite different and who go against what your preconceptions are.
I think you have to have an enormous curiosity. I think that's what drives most of us. And I know I've brought people into the field, you know, to visit with me, and they can't believe that I wouldn't be bored, you know, sitting through endless meetings or sitting through very long religious performances. And for me, these opportunities to sit, to observe, to listen, to be on the sidelines, you know, with a glass of wine in my hand, observing, and then sometimes being called into the dance. It's a kind of an ecstatic experience for me. You know, we're sort of used to being on the fringes, so that works all right. But when you can actually be part of something, when you find that you can be useful to something, as people would say occasionally, you know, that stuff that you wrote about the pollution of the water of Timbauba, can we now go together jointly and bring samples of the water and, you know, finally get some action about it? I mean, I like to believe that the work is of high stakes, and it's not just for the sake of writing, but that hopefully it is even all writing is a form of intervention, and hopefully, you know, in Ireland there was a result of the book that was very positive, is years and years of letters that I've collected from Irish bachelors who write to me. I said I'm sort of like an anthropological Miss Lonely Hearts, because they'll tell me about the loneliness and the fact that they thought they were so alone in what they were experiencing, but by reading, and I write books that are accessible, so if you can read it all, and if they're translated, and Death Without Weeping was translated to Spanish, not into Portuguese, unfortunately, people can recognize themselves. And that's a danger and a risk, but it also leads to a kind of a reflexivity that can be positive as well. So if I felt that everything was negative, I can accept the fact that a community's honor felt, why us? Why did you choose us? But if individuals told me time and again they were hurt or they were devastated, then I would not be able to have the courage to go back and do the work. But the fact is that I know that many people felt liberated by things that they have read.
And this sense that you have to clearly put down what it is that you've heard, because your books are beautifully written as I read them. Where did that skill come from?
Well, I mean, I've always loved writing, so I actually had thought about writing fiction and took many fiction classes at Queens College and found that I could write much better when I was writing from life. So I began to see anthropology as a kind of, going back to the Museum of Natural History, as a kind of natural history of human life. That ethnographic writing is an art form of its own, and it combines description with an ear for the cadences of language, for the odd way that people put things, and the sense that so many of the people we deal with are organic intellectuals who have not had the opportunity to explain to someone outside the village why life proceeds the way it is. So I work with people who are sort of, would have been anthropologists often if they had been trained to do it, but they didn't have the opportunity. They intuit almost, not immediately, but can learn very quickly what this is about, and then they begin to help me and begin to say, here's something you need to see. Or they'll sit down with me and reflect on it. So I can't say where the writing comes from, but I can say that in a sense all anthropological ethnographies are written by a host of people who have pointed us in the direction and who have been willing to recite. Would you mind reciting that poem again? Oh no, not the 10th time. Well, this time I think I'd like to get it on tape so I can get it exactly.
One final question, requiring a short answer, because we're almost through the hour, and that is this tension between theory and practice is something that runs through many traditions. And would you leave us with a comment on how you believe you've integrated this undoubted desire to be an activist, to actually do good in the world, to change things, and on the other hand, this desire to think, to sit back and reflect?
Well, I in an article that I wrote on the primacy of the ethical, suggested that anthropology was at base really it was a kind of a moral philosophy in a sense. And I juxtaposed a very traditional view of the anthropologist as spectator, called the fearless spectator, who's simply sitting there recording, doing a kind of positivistic science, with a view of anthropology that is now shared by many, I think, of the younger generation, of anthropology as a kind of witnessing. And that we're accountable for what we say and for what we do, and for hopefully making our writings available to a larger public and to public policy to somehow have an effect. The anthropologist is always straddling a dichotomy between believing that reflection and understanding is in the nature of an intervention itself, and at times wanting to see a more direct impact on human life. And I've come to see that perhaps it's the witnessing itself and the writing is maybe the best we can do in terms of an intervention, and to leave the applications to others, perhaps more suited to do that than ourselves.
Nancy, thank you very much, and I think the body of your work demonstrates that that formula, that solution, that way of doing things is the right one. So
Thanks, Harry.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
All right.
And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.